Lobbying for electric transportation. Readers of the blog at 2greenenergy.com know that I generally find corporate lobbying offensive, and that I believe that, in a perfect world, the entire practice would be completely abolished. Yet, out of fairness, and out of my respect for EV advocate Brian Wynn, I wanted to include a chapter on this subject. Brian is president of the Electric Drive Transportation Association in Washington, D.C. As a result of several meetings, I have come to believe that the EDTA does a good and fair-minded job in promoting the EV cause. He and I happened to be in attendance at the Business of Plugging In show in Detroit in late 2009, where we sat down for this interview between sessions. Craig Shields, thanks for being here. May I ask you to just introduce the EDTA and its overall purpose? Brian Wynn, sure. EDTA is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. We're a membership-based, not-for-profit organization headquartered in Washington, and our primary function is to advocate for, that is lobby for, federal policies. Our members are inter-industry. We have members from the vehicle manufacturing sector, we have utility companies and other energy providers, and we have component manufacturers such as battery makers. And we also have some of the newer business model folks like Better Place and GridPoint in the smart grid area, Coolum in the charger area, though those guys are providing infrastructure per se. In addition, there are some municipal participants like California Energy Commission of Kings County, some of the leaders in moving the electric drive toward the mainstream or electrifying transportation. CS. So it's a lobby organization? In other words, it's a voice on Capitol Hill to make sure that policy is created that works for all its members? BW, yes, but first and foremost our mission is to make sure that policy doesn't disadvantage the movement toward electrifying transportation, and, if anything, helps to accelerate this technology toward the mainstream by doing several things. First, we support research and development. There's a lot of federal dollars that are targeted toward research and development. We make sure that this technology, whether it be battery technology or hybridization or component technology or fuel cell technologies, that we get our fair share of that. CS, well, if you're still here after 20 years, I can only assume you've had some success. BW, market incentives, like tax credits for hybrid vehicles, that was one of our wins. I'm referring to the tax credits for plug-in electric drive vehicles. We played a key role in crafting that. We actually crafted the language that resulted in the tax credits that are now available. We've had a lot to do with demonstration and deployment money, and then most recently money either in loan format, or direct grants for battery and component manufacturing. So, all of these are different pieces to the puzzle. It all revolves around how public policy can support electrified transportation. CS, great. Let me ask you a little bit about each. Let's start with the last one first. Are we talking about stimulus money? BW, yes. That was a big opportunity, to get money from the government directed specifically toward advanced technology vehicles. Green jobs. Those are the two words that everybody is using in Washington right now. How do we make certain that we are creating jobs for the future? That play right into our wheelhouse. The monies that we were talking about went up by an order of magnitude as people started talking. CS, yes, there's a lot of money. What have you gotten allocated so far? I guess if you include renewable energy more largely, you get a different figure than electric transportation more narrowly. BW, yes. For electric transportation more narrowly, you're talking about $2.5 million. So that's not an insignificant amount of money. And in many respects the timing couldn't have been better. Here we are, trying to make a transition to advanced technology vehicle manufacturing at a time when no one can find capital for the automobile industry. That's starting to change now, but for a while there it was difficult for anyone to get capitalized, and the auto industry of course was under a lot of pressure because of reduced sales and other issues. Just generally speaking, they're trying to reduce capacity. So the stimulus money really came along at an excellent time. CS, good. Let me ask you about demonstration and deployment. What does that actually mean? BW, here's a good example that will illustrate this. When we started talking about stimulus funds, the utility companies said, we want to see how this is going to work on our grid, and the automobile companies said, here's the configuration of the vehicle that we are planning on bringing out, we'd like to see how it works on your grid. There you have a project where there were the two of them that can come together with public support on a 50/50 basis. So the utility companies and the vehicle manufacturers were coming to the government saying, we are going to put up 50% of the dollars, you're going to put up 50% of the dollars, and we are going to get a significant number of vehicles out there, like 100 to 300 vehicles. Up to 1,000 vehicles that plug into the grid. CS, just to measure and then extrapolate what this would mean if there were 1,000 times that many? BW, there's going to be a time of learning that goes on around those demonstration and deployment programs. There are two targets. One is to see how the consumers react. How do consumers actually drive these vehicles? How do they leverage the technology? Secondly, you have fleet operators. How are fleet operators going to use these vehicles? And of course, fleet operators use different metrics than your typical consumer does. For instance, I think in terms of miles per gallon, where fleet operators think in terms of cost per mile. So those are two different targets. But both are going to be required, ultimately, to get to the mainstream. CS, do you mind expanding on this thing about the tax credits? BW, think about the adoption of any technology. In the initial phase, you've got early adopters that are enthusiastic. They are excited by things that don't motivate the vast majority of consumers or fleet operators. Whereas the Prius has now become the second best-selling car in Japan, initially it was of interest to a very small number of people. Economics apply here. You have the cost of ramping up, the capitalization of new manufacturing, the technology itself particularly with regard to energy storage. Lithium-ion batteries are expensive. How do we get down that cost curve? Well, the answer is volume. How do you get across Geoffrey Moore's chasm, the valley of death? You need to reduce the price premium for the fleet operator or the consumer, and you need to change their metric, that is, how they are thinking. The forecasting models are heavily dependent upon the price of gas and the price of batteries. We have chosen not to control the price of gas. So we need to work on the other side of that. The vast majority of the premium associated with the advanced technology vehicle is the cost of the batteries. So we crafted language, which Senator Obama, when he was a senator, along with Senators Hatch from Utah and Cantwell from Washington State, introduced, saying, the larger your battery pack in these vehicles, the greater the public good because the more oil you're going to displace, the more greenhouse gas emissions you're going to reduce, therefore the greater the tax credit. It tops out at $7,500 for light-duty vehicles. CS, that carry 30 to 40 kilowatt hours or something? BW, no, actually, the top end of the scale is either 15 or 16 kilowatt hours. Now we're working on medium and heavy duty tax credits. We had to give some of that ground back. There were kickers in the initial legislation for larger gross vehicle weights, and those got taken back in the stimulus package. We now have legislation in the hopper with some good champions that will help the medium and heavy-duty side. CS, can you speak to the tax credits at the state level? Obviously there are 50 different discussions, but can you just summarize that? BW, obviously, some states are more activist in this regard than others, and we don't play at that level right now. But there are not just tax credits. There are other non-monetary incentives like HOV lane or carpool lane access and things like that, which are very valuable to particular individuals. Obviously those that would benefit from having access to those lanes and so forth. So, there have been some states that have gotten out ahead on this and said, for one reason or another, we believe this is really important for us. In some instances it might be municipal authorities that are looking at air quality issues and so forth. They want to incentivize people to use cleaner vehicles. But if you want to look at states, look at Texas. Here's a state which is largely associated with fossil fuels, historically, and yet they've done an amazing job building out wind generation and are in the process of building distribution for that. And with people like Roger Duncan, who is on my board of directors, they are doing the nitty-gritty stuff to build this grid that will support electrified transportation. It's an amazing story. CS, well, to me, discussion of the way this breaks down at the state government level is very interesting from a legal and philosophic level. Take California as an example, where we are driving out businesses with extremely aggressive legislation on diesel. It causes an exodus of jobs moving to Arizona and Nevada, and it happens fairly rapidly. Arizona can say, we don't have strict air quality standards. This makes a huge problem for all of us who are trying to make California actually work, where there is no level of consistency and fairness. On a new subject, I think most readers have some level of cynicism about what happens inside the Beltway in terms of not wanting to see how sausage is made. What can you tell readers who might be cynical about what happens in the back rooms of government and the lobbyists who deal with them? BW, it's perhaps not the typical story that most people would think about. I'm working on a 25-year career at this point, including my work for a United States Senator. The vast majority of folks that we are dealing with on Capitol Hill understand that, for reasons of energy security, for reasons of environmental quality, and for economic reasons, we have to embrace advanced technology for transportation. They understand that we need a grid which is more reliable, more efficient, and cleaner. These things are not really in debate right now. But how you get from here to there, of course, is very tricky, particularly regarding renewables. Because energy is not so much partisan as it is regional. That's always been the story in Washington regarding energy. Everybody's in favor of more efficient vehicles. There's nobody that's not in favor of that anymore. Even the automobile industry has essentially engaged in this battle. How do we get to a completely different paradigm in a way that the consumer is actually going to benefit as quickly as possible? In fact, the vast majority of members of Congress have been coming to us and saying, how can we help? Now that's unusual in Washington. Usually it's the other way around, where industries are going to Capitol Hill trying to defeat regulations or trying to get the government out of their businesses. We don't play defense. We play offense. But now there are lots and lots of champions that want to be on this team. They want to get it done. They want to do the right thing. The tricky part is not now. It's going to be 2 or 3 years down the road when members of Congress want to be able to point to results. Washington is a tactical environment driven by election cycles rather than a strategic environment driven by the greater good. Now, I know that any good politician is going to say, I'm doing this in the interest of the greater good, this is my vision of what's good for the country, etc. But suffice it to say that reasonable men disagree about that. Even reasonable politicians disagree about that. So there is a lot of tactical maneuvering that goes on. And that's not a bad thing. I don't cast aspersions on that. CS, well, most people I think would. Most people look forward to a day when there is broad campaign finance reform, driving more enlightenment and less parochialism. BW, well, we're going in the wrong direction. I wanted to think that when the Obama administration came in, that might have marked a turning point. The jury is out on that tactically speaking until after the midterm election, and if we have sort of a Newt Gingrich revolution on our hands at the midterm, like Clinton witnessed, I don't know where it goes from there. Essentially we will have been rewarding scare tactics and partisanship rather than what I sense Senator Obama ran on, candidate Obama ran on, and what he came to office wanting to bring to Washington. It is difficult to get people to change their tactical approach. In order to be successful, we have got to defend consistent policies. We have got to have consistent policies going forward because it's going to take a long time to transition a huge fleet. It's not going to work for every single vehicle model or vehicle platform. There are certain vehicle platforms today where electrification makes a dramatic amount of sense, economically, environmentally, commercially, however you want to draw it up. CS, for example, small, intra-urban commuter vehicles. BW, better example, off-road vehicles. There is a huge number of off-road vehicles that are completely electric. You look at the low-hanging fruit, you've got port applications. You've got ground support at the airport, things like that. These are areas that we can influence directly with public policy. But everybody's looking at the prize, which is the consumer, ultimately the vast majority in the volume of consumer vehicles or fleet vehicles, etc. It's going to take a long time to turn that fleet over. How do we accomplish that in a tactical environment? How do we maintain the strategic vision and persistence, consistency of policy, that's going to be required to get this done? This is where our political system is going to work against us. I don't want to say it's going to fail us, because I don't know. We need to assess the cost of oil dependence, and see if we have some good politicians that can point to that and say, the price of this dependence is too high. CS, let me just ask you about the cost of dependence. BW, if you have a business with a certain vulnerability, you get an insurance policy. We are 97% dependent upon one global fungible commodity for the people and goods in this country. That is unacceptable. So if a politician wants to be associated with success, he wants to hold that up and point to that. We all want to be associated with success, so I'm not making politicians wrong for that. But they want to be able to say, we deployed this number of vehicles inside this election cycle. But that's not going to happen when it takes 18 months for the battery manufacturer to get a piece of capital equipment functioning that's worth tens of millions of dollars, coming from Japan, which is the only place where they make them. We just don't spin up automobile-grade battery manufacturing in this country overnight. Our challenge at this point is to articulate in a way that politicians can be champions of a consistent policy over the medium and the long term. They can actually see this is making a difference and are moving toward it. It's like a front-end loaded mortgage. You pay a little bit now, you bring that deployment schedule in a little bit, and the benefits on the back end are enormous. The benefits in terms of oil displaced and greenhouse gas emissions reduced. But those benefits are further out in the future. It takes a lot of volume up here to get to those benefits. We just need to keep working on it, and be consistent about it. That's going to be the challenge inside of the Washington environment, and Washington is playing a critical role and will continue to play a critical role. CS, let's go back to your vision as to the role that both the public and private sectors should be playing to drive this forward. BW, well, it cuts in two different directions. From a policy perspective, we've got to craft policies that are going to benefit the greater good over the long term. That's not always easy to do when you've got a whole bunch of different cross-cutting interests that are in that game. And yes, there are politics behind alternative fuels and who gets how much money, etc. The car companies themselves are not of a single mind on what the best way to configure this technology is. In fact, in many respects, they are all taking a slightly different approach, looking at different parts of the marketplace. But to be fair, at this particular point in the adoption cycle, we are not entirely sure what the category killer is here yet. What's the iPhone out there for the car? Is there one? Does that even make sense? Does that even apply? The beauty is that electric drive is so flexible as a technology that it can be configured a lot of different ways. At some point we are going to need to standardize around certain things, but you can't rush that process. And, for crying out loud, you don't want the government trying to do that. The government will not make those decisions efficiently or effectively, and the government has convinced itself of this, and certainly convinced business people of this, over the decades. I think the government's helping GM in the bailout package was a function of people's jobs being at stake, and a large segment of our manufacturing economy being at risk. I don't think it was a statement that government wants to be making these decisions. The tricky part here is, and this is a little bit controversial what I'm going to say, if you were choosing a quick path to profitability for any automobile company, you wouldn't choose this one. CS, you mean EVs generally? BW, right, EVs generally, because it's a new technology and it, ipso facto, takes longer to get to profitability with a new technology. The automobile industry in the United States, while worldwide, this is not a U.S. phenomenon that we are dealing with, are doing this for different reasons, and we are doing this on a different time scale. I happen to be most focused on the U.S., but 3 weeks ago I was in China listening to the Chinese through interpreters saying many of the same things and asking each other many of the same questions that you're asking me today and that I get from other folks in the media. You know, how long is this going to take? And, what's the quickest path to the prize here? The answer is that's really difficult to know. And anybody who really thinks that they know hasn't studied technology convergence in other segments. And I've done a lot of that. I'm relatively new to the automobile arena, and I'm only here because of the fact that so many different technologies come into play here, and we play into the larger transportation system. But if you look at what's happening from a macroeconomic standpoint, the price of energy is going to continue to go up. It almost has to. There is nothing out there that says you can plan on cheaper energy in the future. So if you take that as a given, We have to learn how to optimize our use of energy better. Transportation is a key portion of that. Geopolitically, I don't even have to go there. We understand that our money is now flowing. We are borrowing it from one place in the world and we are giving it to another place. This is not good for the world and it's not good for us. We are creating huge imbalances here that are not sustainable from a geopolitical or a macroeconomic point of view. We are doing this because we have to do this. CS, so you are saying that the world auto industry is doing this but because it has to. In other words, that it's come to the realization that the current trajectory of this thing with fossil fuels, etc., is not sustainable? BW, it can't possibly be sustainable. It's a limited resource. So the challenge we run into here is that I work in an environment that doesn't think in multiple decade planning. But now we have to. If we look at the risks associated with climate change and we look at the pure economics of the price of energy going up because fossil fuels are a limited commodity and they exist in particular parts of the world. Perhaps I'm getting too general. CS, no, actually, I completely agree. By the way, for what it's worth, I think that you are right about the short term. You're right about the next 8 or 10 years. I think you're wrong about the next 30 years. BW, in terms of price of energy? You may be right. CS, and that's simply because BW will get more efficient? CS, we'll see wholesale replacement of certain fuels, for example, coal, with technologies, for example, solar thermal. Whatever you say about renewables needs to include the notion that the price will continuously fall. It's about technology. Technology only gets better. Where peak oil means that oil gets pricier, technology always improves. In other words, we get more transistors on a chip, we get more watts per square meter of PV, etc. now than we did 2 years ago. Renewables really boils down to one question: with what efficiency can you harvest the energy from the sun? BW, well, I can come up with probably a dozen examples of where you are right, but we still have gotten on an unsustainable path here with transportation. Unsustainable from the standpoint of safety, of convenience. You know, we clog our roads so badly in major metropolitan areas. It's unsustainable from an environmental standpoint if you believe half of what scientists are saying about climate change. And then there are the macroeconomic, the geopolitical elements of this. For all of these reasons, we have to change. The problem is, unlike cell phones or Wi-Fi or barcodes or, pick a whole bunch of different examples of things that have been enabled and are now indispensable because of the internet. Because of what we talked about in our earlier discussion, this is going to take longer. People are really attached to their cars. I am really attached to my car. I'll drive my car till the wheels come off of it. I'm trained as an economist, and so buying a new car is painful for me. I like leveraging the investment that I've got in my existing vehicle and putting my money into something else. I just got back from China, and had dinner with my good friend who runs an institute over there. He and his wife both drive vehicles like mine. That's what every Chinese is now moving toward. The Chinese went from making 250,000. I don't know how many electric bikes they were making a year, but now there are 800 million electric bikes on the road. That was inside of 4 years, and that was without government assistance. All of those people are now going to want to step up into something. If we don't deal effectively with our traffic issues, we're all going to be riding a bus or we'll be riding a train because nothing is going to move in traffic. Now, If the Chinese can do with vehicles and liquid fuels what they did with cell phones, where they just leaped right over the terrestrial system and went right to wireless, we've got a prayer. They might actually show us how to do it. I think we need to pay attention to that. The other element about Washington that I wanted to bring in here, we tend to oversimplify everything in Washington. We want to make it Fisher-Price. We tend to want to say this can be done easily, and as a result the expectations get out of whack and then politicians turn. They go from being champions to being haters, and we can't afford that. So, part of what we are trying to do in EDTA is be realistic, be credible, and say, yes, there is a huge opportunity here, and there are tremendous payoffs down the road, but let's not underestimate the challenges associated in getting from here to there. Let's make a decision that we are going to stick with this, that this really is a medium-term thing. This isn't like the adoption of Wi-Fi or something like that where the prices go from $4,000 for an access point down to $65 at Radio Shack. It's going to take a long time to get electric drive under the hood of the mainstream number of vehicles that are already out on the street driving around, let alone plugging into the grid in ways that are economically, commercially, environmentally sensible. CS. We just heard a presentation from GM that, in my estimation, contained a lot of platitudinous garbage. But mixed in were some ideas that I thought were on track. For example, the metaphor about the flat-screen TV and the prices falling down. And it is true that a company like General Motors has to pay the price for the fact that we just don't have the scale to bring down the price of EVs. Somebody has to pay for that. BW, right. The mainstream consumer is using metrics that are essentially only appropriate to an older transportation system. Even though we think we've made some good investments in electric drive, at what point do we start migrating the kind of monies that are being invested into protecting and sustaining our existing fuel system into this new fuel system? That gets inside Washington's internecine warfare, and you will have big battles between the oil industry and the other players. CS, I am asking you to comment on certain things that may be sensitive, and I'll understand if you don't want to. Here's one: if you are a vice president of anything at GM, or Ford, or Toyota, the value of the 401k is really a function of your ability to sell and maintain profitable relationships with customers that include cars, parts, and service, then a new car every few years. Here you have EVs that go 500,000 miles before they even need a tune-up. So if you're an OEM, you may be doing it because you have to, but you certainly aren't doing it because you want to. Do you consider that true or not? BW, this is an industry-wide movement. It has to be. We are talking about people working, we're talking about money being made, we are talking about the next generation of jobs. We are talking about technologies being leveraged here that don't necessarily originate in the automobile business. We are talking about the grid, and the information technology and back-office systems. There are so many different moving parts here. So, the answer to your question is I think it is good for them. I think it's got to be good for them, and the reason I say that is because this is blood sport. The automobile business is a low-margin blood sport business. But how did Ferrari survive? Well, they survive because they've got a differentiation. That's not low margin. These guys differentiate around technology in many respects. That's not how all of them make their money, but there are really a couple of cross-cutting things here, whereas at the end of the day, yes, some of these companies, their business models over the past have been based on high-margin trucks and things like that. The Prius wouldn't have been as successful. The Prius wouldn't have been possible, without faster microprocessor speeds and better software. That had nothing to do with the automobile. You know, that started in a completely different place. Now vehicles are so computerized, and why shouldn't they be? That's how we create optimization. So if I am working for any automobile company right now, I am recognizing that advanced technology is the wave of the future and I want to be differentiating around advanced technology. That's the only point I was making. CS, and that may trump what I was saying, though personally I don't think so. I think that if they could have turned the clock back to the day that they were selling Oldsmobiles to retirees every 2.5 years, they would have those days back in the snap of a finger. BW, and these guys are not monolithic in their thinking. There are tremendous debates going on inside these companies. I've been privileged to be party to several close-up, and there's phenomenal skepticism within these companies about advanced technology and how it ultimately lands in the marketplace, and how you get down the cost curve. There is even greater skepticism in the utility industry about, why do we want to confuse ourselves with this? Isn't this a bit of a distraction? CS, well, where I was going with this thing. Even if we can agree that Big Auto is ambivalent, Big Oil is not at all ambivalent. I think it's clear that Big Oil wants to kill this. I moderated a panel at the Alt Car Expo in Santa Monica last fall where I pointed out that Chevron's asking us to imagine them, an oil company, as being a part of the solution. That is simply too hard for some of us to imagine. BW, well, that's painting with a pretty broad brush. A lot of people would say things like that about politicians, but there are some people like Jay Ainsley. I shouldn't single one particular individual out, but if you read his book A Flawless Fire, this is a guy who puts all these pieces together. He's a smart guy who really gets it. He should be commended for that. And he's from a place where it's not an accident. People in that area vote for people who care about their environment. We just need more of that. We need more people that are going to connect those dots. CS, thanks so much, Brian. Great speaking with you. For more information on this contributor, please visit http://2greenenergy.com/ renewable-energy-facts-fantasies/